maybe it's the writer in me, or maybe it's how my grandmother nearly fell into the dustbin of history. It's the women whose voices weren't heard. It's the ghosts in the landscape that are, ought to come alive again, that I'm maybe even just as curious about. And that's where, yes, we need to write about famous women and women who've inspired us and continue to, but we need to search out those other unknown ones. We need to rescue them.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada and small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Denise Chong, economist, public servant, political advisor, author. Denise is recognized as a trailblazer, an economic policy advisor in the male-dominated world of government finance. She started her career in 1975 in the Department of Finance in Ottawa, and in 1980 was appointed to the Prime Minister's office, becoming his senior economic advisor until Mr. Trudeau's retirement. Denise is an acclaimed author. She's written and published 5 literary nonfiction books and edited a compilation of short stories. Her first book, The Concubine's Children, it was the first nonfiction narrative account of Chinese individuals in Canada and a Globe and Mail bestseller for 93 weeks. Denise is passionate about women's voices and produced and edited the Penguin Anthology of Stories by Canadian Women, published in 1997. She served on a range of boards and committees, including the Task Force on the Participation of Visible Minorities in the Federal Public Services, which has been instrumental in championing diversity and inclusion in government. Denise received the Order of Canada in 2013. In her latest book, published in 2024, Out of Darkness, Denise takes a story of an individual caught in the eye of history to examine an issue of our times.
Growing up in BC, tell us a little bit about the influences, what shaped you, what made you want to be an economist, first of all, and then exploring some of your historical roots.
I was born in Vancouver, and this is now the 50s. My parents were not in Chinatown, but we would go to Chinatown where I'd visit my grandmother. And then by the time I was 5, we moved to northern BC. So I'd left that abruptly behind, and suddenly we were the only Asian family amongst 20, 30 other white families living on Prince George Airport. So my identity was already almost immediately halved. There was one on the mainland in Vancouver, and then one in northern BC. So I grew up in Prince George, and I think when I look back, what really shaped me, including my work and my outlook, was that I was living in a frontier. So a frontier not only in the struggles of people sometimes at the margins, a boom-bust economy, a town without a university. I went to school we lived in a rural area, and there were kids who didn't have hot water at home, Indigenous children who I didn't see after grade 6. They dropped out of school. And then I think that idea of the frontier gave me a sense of wanting to explore always and go beyond and understand and not being afraid of what lay beyond. So I think I credit that northern BC upbringing with informing my whole outlook and even my writing, because it's allowed me to think that it's necessary to push beyond. So then by the time I came to decide what to do, well, my generation's the first to be university educated. My parents' generation didn't have money and were excluded from a lot of the opportunities available to everybody else, including higher education, certain professions, the vote. My parents didn't have the vote till it was declared that, they could be declared as citizens even though they were born in Canada. Of course, I didn't know that growing up. Well, when we were kids, my siblings and I, we were very involved in music. So kind of music and arts were what I was thinking of. Then I go down to UBC to go to university, and I realize I'm interested in theater, the arts, writing. I've been interested in that. And I realize I'm already piling up the student loans. It isn't going to get me work. It isn't going to allow me to meet my monthly payments on my student loans when I graduate. And I headed towards economics.
How interesting.
So and I didn't think then that, what course should I be in? I just sampled all kinds of academic areas. When I look back, I realized I don't think there was another woman in most of my economics classes.
That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what we're doing with our conversations with women authors and some of the trailblazers or the women who led campaigns in the 70s and 80s is actually to also address some of those issues with young people, hopefully when they see this, and they can find their own path by telling these kinds of stories. Like, how did you discover you wanted to go into economics, which is pretty rigorous and pretty male and pretty...
Yes, absolutely.
So how did you feel with all that maleness and you're trying to, carve your own path?
Well, when I think about identity, since I was young, I felt that it was being, in certain ways, imposed. So we first arrive in Prince George and people only notice our ethnicity because there aren't any Asians around and there aren't any Chinese around except, the couple of Chinese cafes in town. But they got over that quickly and, we became one of them. So I didn't really think about that. My identity was rooted in how I saw myself and what I wanted to do. So it only is until I get thrown into these situations and other people begin to try and impose identity and I push back at it that I start thinking, oh, this is really male dominated, because it was male dominated in economics. I then go to Ottawa into the Department of Finance. It's completely male dominated. It's not only that, it's an old boys network. So I only see that when others start to impose that on me because I continue to, stand firm on what I think my own identity is. But then I quickly realized I was butting up against it.
I want to explore that a little bit because, the next series of questions was really about you move to Ottawa, you go to the Department of Finance, you are young.
Yes, very young.
You're a woman.
Yes.
And you're Asian.
And I'm from the West.
And from the West, and that was a Liberal government.
Yeah, but the country and the capital was dominated really by Easterners. There was a sense of, the West was still far away. It was still the beginnings of Western alienation. So it was kind of a strike against you also that you were from the West.
The kind of files you worked on. I mean, what was the kind of work that you did at the Department of Finance? Well,
I arrived in the mid-'70s, and I arrived because, in effect, I benefited from the Old Boys Network. It opened the door for me because a professor at UBC had UBC, Queens, McGill. They were kind of the feeding ground for Department of Finance. So that's how I went through the door that was opened. I also worked, what they saw to my credit was I worked for the UBC newspaper. So I had a lot of those. I had that behind me as a writer. But once I got into the department, I worked in a unit where we were briefing the minister for cabinet. And we were briefing on various departments. So our department, we were looking after oil and gas, the environment, forestry, agriculture, those sorts of resource departments. And they were hot issues at the time because the oil shock had happened, OPEC oil shock. People were, the policymakers were concerned about inflation. So there were issues of food marketing boards, egg marketing boards, milk marketing boards. The price of sugar had spiked. At the same time, there were these social concerns. You know, people in the East were stuck in a fishing way of life, or there were issues called fishing for stamps because unemployment insurance was barely keeping people afloat. There were worries about the family farm. So there were all kinds of things jostling against one another. And that's when I began to see, because you were also briefing for the minister, that line between policy and then when it falls to the politicians to make these sorts of judgments.
And then you moved over to the Prime Minister's office.
Yes.
After X number of years at Parliament.
Yes. But I had a bit of I had reason to leave the Department of Finance, which I didn't talk about for a long time, but I feel I should now because I've lifted my guilt at not having talked about it. So I arrive in the department and I've looked up the stats. I was one of 8 women in the department of almost 200. So there were really very few women. There were secretaries, the typing pool, clerical, but people in, economic positions, there were very few. So I'm there for, in my 5th year there, there's a new deputy minister, and I'm pegged saying that executive assistant position is coming up, and we think you'd be great for it for various reasons. Advancement of women, you've proven yourself, briefed for the minister, various ministers had known your name because your briefing notes would go up. So I assumed that was going to happen, and they began to fill in behind me. And then one day, the gentleman who delivers the mail, this is years ago, runs around in his little cart, and he's putting press releases on our desks for the day, and it announces the new executive assistant. I'm thinking, I'm going down to human resources. So I go down to human resources and I say, what's up? I didn't even get an interview. And I learn that the deputy minister did not want a woman in that position. I was gone within 2 weeks. I left. I never explained. I thought over the years, I should have stayed and stood my ground and fought. But in those days, you needed a Me Too to speak out. So I had been attracted to Ottawa and public service and, expanding my horizons. And I'm a product of Trudeau-mania.
Yep.
Many of us were.
Yep.
We were just, it was a magnet to come to the center and to contribute and to be part of something larger and understand the whole expanse of the country. So when the election happened in 1980 and there was very little Western representation, political representation west of Winnipeg, I thought, I'm from the West. This is what I've always had in my mind to contribute. And I joined the PMO.
I worked on that campaign. And I joined the PMO
right
after you. You came in as the BC desk.
Yes.
So for the deputy minister not to want you because you're a woman, and then you land this fabulous position in the Prime Minister's office.
Yes.
How did he feel?
Right. Well, I never confronted that person. That person has since passed on. But it's a lesson. And I've thought about how people don't, still today, maybe inhibited women if they held back from speaking out, and what support women need to speak out and to fight. When I look back at that, at least I had the wherewithal to say, all right, I'm not staying here with these sorts of attitudes. I'm moving on.
Yeah.
And
you moved up. And you moved up. And you moved up.
I moved on. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
And Prime Minister Trudeau never exhibited any of that, right? There was never any sense of gender bias of any kind.
No, he had some really good women in his office.
Mm-hmm.
There were really good women, Mary Ellen Fox and Maud Barlow. I mean, there were some really, Joyce Fairburn, who was his, right hand. I mean, there were fabulous women in his office. So, and I was a young staffer at that time doing youth politics, youth policy.
Yes.
That's when we first met. So you started off working on the BC desk, and then you became his senior economic policy advisor, which again, you would have been working on some really interesting issues because the economy was also in a really bad way. I mean, Canada was really in bad shape in the 1980s.
Well, governments are ambitious. That was an ambitious tenure for Pierre Trudeau. There were huge policy changes in the West. And so while the larger issues, of course, are managed by PCO and finance, and then we may offer our layer on top once you put the political sort of transparency on top of that. In my tenure there, I was really pushing those major projects through the West. So people today wouldn't be familiar with them, but there was something called the Crow's Nest Pass Rate, which were in place for almost a century. And you're dealing with the railroads and you're juggling major interests. There were huge investments out west. There were ports being put in BC. There was coal being negotiated, Northwest Coal in British Columbia. There was the light rapid transit in Vancouver. There was Expo 86. There were huge issues out west, which required aides really to help shepherd them through caucus and ministers and so on.
But that's really important. This is a history project. And so we have to look back and find out what the big issues are. And to know that there are women working on these big issues. I remember Crow's Pass. I remember, those big issues. I remember the ports issue. So I remember those. But there's a lot. So this is a history project. So what we want to do, and to have a woman actually help put together the political lens on the work that was being done by the government is really quite,
because
quite interesting.
Because not only were there the policy issues to juggle, there was the political differences.
Yeah, National Energy Program.
To mend, yes. And there was growing Western alienation. So you were juggling many things at once. And so that was, well, you see the importance of political representation across the country because, of course, ministers ought to be fronting a lot of that. But with that uneven political representation, it was a time when, we had to work very closely with ministers and with cabinet and help juggle those the political moods in Alberta were then as now were wildly different between Alberta and Quebec. And so we were juggling all of that. And so you'd write those things in your memorandums you'd be writing notes to the Prime Minister and then sometimes popping them on top of the briefing book that went to 24 Sussex. And those are sometimes where those things would get sorted out.
Yeah.
And then, Pierre Trudeau at the time, near the end of that tenure, was on his global peace initiative.
North-South.
Yes. So at the same time, we were recognizing that the economic issues were still needed to be addressed. And there were, huge economic debates at that time. So I also, at that time, tried to, as the economic policy and the PMO, I tried to, and this is also at the Prime Minister's direction and the Principal Secretary, we tried to, in a sense, ventilate the system. So there wasn't just the input of the bureaucracy, but we would try to ventilate the system with new academics and new scholars and people who were speaking out on issues and, bring that thinking in. So that was also a task.
Interesting. We could talk about, that time in office and of course we while we didn't work together, we were part of that family.
Yes.
And there were some pretty formidable male allies in that office.
Yes.
Tom Axworthy.
Yes,
Jim
absolutely.
Coots, you know.
Absolutely.
You
Tom
know,
was fabulous.
Tom has always been a breath of fresh air, and he's still quite, we couldn't get as far or as fast with it.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really important to know
Yes.
that we didn't work in isolation
No.
as women.
No.
You know, we had some really good, strong allies.
Yes. Supporters.
Yeah. I
People
still
who stood up for you.
Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
great thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Great thinkers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was quite a nice time. We're going to move on a little bit. I want to talk about your work, and you mentioned something about Canadian identity or multiple identities. You know, you're being Chinese Canadian and Canadian, but with a Chinese background. So transitioning from your work as an economist, and then you go into some things that are very, very, very personal about your family and your family's history. And it was a big shift in your career. So I presume once in 1984, after the Liberal government was defeated, like many of us,
Yes.
we did other things.
Yes.
And you went into writing.
The Pierre Trudeau, you know, his tenure ended in 84. I actually never left public policy behind. In the actual physical sense, I straddled both worlds. So I still kept my interest in public policy. I served on boards. I served on task forces. I shepherded through something called, there was the clerk of the Privy Council at one point was concerned about the representation of visible minorities. So I shepherded through a task force on visible minorities in the public service and representation of the public service. So I kept my hand in public policy. So when I say I straddled two worlds, because I also began writing, in fact, you know, people say, how can you be an economist and write? It just seems so, you know, at odds. I think it informed my work, my writing. An economist, you know, you're partly looking at behavioral influences. You're looking at the factors that affect outcomes one way or the other. You're weighing things, and those are all skills that you bring into writing. All my nonfiction stories have been embedded in a social context.
Yes.
And so they're, in a sense, social history. I look as much at the economic, the cultural, the political factors in all those nonfiction stories. And why? Well, sometimes my grandmother, did she really pay attention? She really couldn't read and write. You know, she had to have people interpret for her. My grandfather could barely read and write. I write about the Vietnamese girl. She's just, you know, trapped in a tiny, in the war. It's so close to her that she doesn't really know what's going on in the larger picture of war. I write about Tiananmen Square, the person, Lu Docheng, my character's growing up in a tiny Chinese village, not very educated. What do these people know about the context of their lives? Well, I do believe the context is very important because it informs human temperament. That's how you judge what a human temperament is. If they're, let's say, weak and just go along with riding the tide of it, or if they fight against it and take action. It informs the mood and temperament of society, of a whole country. So that, being an economist, actually, I never really left it behind, in other words. I think it informed even my outlook.
Tell us a little bit about doing the research for the Concubine's children. I mean, that was your first and highly acclaimed book,
Mm-hmm.
which must have made you just really, first out of the gate, was pretty spectacular. But what really informed, like, what kind of history did you have to go into, and And having just taken a look at it recently, there's a lot of detail back and forth between Vancouver and China. And, tell us a little bit about that, about the history.
The first obstacle, which is huge, is breaking a wall of silence. So it's not just from my mother, who I need to get into my previous generation, but it's a whole community because of the shame of what were the Chinatowns, which were kind of excluded from the larger society. Then there's the silence of my education of my generation. There was not a word of that history in my schooling, in the curriculum. It entered the curriculum very late. So I felt when I was going into Chinatown, I remember having this distinct feeling. I felt like someone had taken paint and painted around the windows so that even the windows were sealed shut. I had to chip that paint off to just even get the window open, to get people to talk. Even after the book was out, I would get letters saying, oh, you wrote about your grandmother who was a concubine and a Katoi Nui, which is a dim sum waitress, who's there to woo men to spend money at the tea houses. And the letter said, that's shameful what you did. There's so many strong women you could have written about. Or you could have written about the Chinese families who sent their sons to fight for Canada in the war, even though they didn't have the vote. So there's real sense at the time of what was legitimate history, that somehow it was to glorify. You had to have worked hard, prayed hard. You had to have been heroic in your past. Otherwise, you somehow didn't justify having a voice. So that was the biggest obstacle and a huge one. And when you've broken it down, then it allows others to, I didn't know that at the time, of course, but allows others to then follow. It becomes easier and easier to break that silence.
There must have been great joy, though, for you to discover some of the things that you discovered and the things that you would have learned, and finally having such success with the Concubine's children. There must have been some joy in that too. Like, you've got through those barriers. People are talking to you, and you're just discovering more and more and more. And it's an interesting story.
Joy in the sense that I do believe that when there's unknowns in a family, they fester. And they fester from one generation to the next, and they carry forward. So if you don't go back and examine those or understand them, and in some sense it's just like they say, understanding your origins, but if you air that out and they're not festering anymore, it just allows you to step more confidently and more knowledgeably into your own future. So, it allowed me, yes, to understand my mother's angst and the whispering behind the closed bedroom door with my father, like, what was it? And understanding my grandmother who died. She was an alcoholic, and she died in a car accident, and when she never trusted anybody but my father to drive her. So she was still being discriminated against on the night that she died, because the Vancouver police decided they were going to clean up Chinatowns and they weren't going to allow mahjong parlors. So my grandmother had to get a ride out to the suburbs to get a game of mahjong to celebrate New Year's. So yes, there's that satisfaction in that you've resolved some of the things that have been festering. And then there's the satisfaction that you've got the courage to go into the unknown. And that, I think, is huge, not just to inform my writing, but generally how you live your life.
They talk a lot now, in relation to Indigenous peoples, they talk a lot about intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
So that's what you're talking about. That's what you're describing, is that intergenerational trauma, which our generation should be able to overcome in some ways because we've examined the past and we are a little bit more clear-minded. but intergenerational trauma is real.
And if it's not your own, should you've had the privilege of having such a comfortable life and generations that transition smoothly from one to the next, you still need to understand that the whole issue of empathy and humility about your own, luck. You still have to have that empathy so that you understand. It's not just empathy. You have to learn to, I believe, you need to feel uncomfortable in order to empathize and understand how you're going to contribute to making a difference in bettering other people's lives and situations. So only sometimes by maybe in a sense borrowing these stories or with writing, if writing achieves what it's trying to do, it's trying to put the reader in that person's, intimately into that person's shoes, so that you can feel that uncomfortableness and therefore see yourself differently in the world.
So in rereading some of the pages of the Concubines' children, you really do get a feeling of being an immigrant. And you've described it really well. And you put yourself in Mei Ying's place, being a stranger, being young, being pretty, being used to attract men, to not, knowing that there's another wife in China and there's other children in China. Like, you actually start to feel it and have that empathetic view. But what was interesting is I had never really thought about an immigrant's experience.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to go in and have a chat about that, the immigrant's experience, and you do the same with Kim Phuc. I mean, her story, and I remember we met her in London. We did an event in London with her when that book was published. But, here's this little girl who was probably it's the most famous picture out of the Vietnam War. And her story, describe her story a little bit. And again, that immigrant experience, what happened when she came to Canada.
You wanted me to describe her story?
Yeah.
So when I took on the story of the napalm victim, Kim Phuc, I'm as interested in that moment of history as I am in examining a period of my own life that I lived through and didn't understand at the time. The Vietnam War, so in placing her there, I'm as much, the canvas is quite large. It's America, it's Vietnam, reaches back into Indochina. And then, the war is moved on. It started early, Indo-Chinese War. And then by the time the bomb falls on that highway in Trong Bang, her village, and the children are running down the road and Kim Phuc is burned, the war is almost over. She's 13 months in a burn unit, so she knows very little of what has happened. The war soon ends. In North Vietnam, there's the victor and the vanquished. So Kim Phuc kind of disappears into anonymity because she's a Southerner. Then she is found, this picture, and they decide they're going to find the girl in the picture because it has propaganda use for the new regime, which is the North Vietnamese, now the government and the communist regime, and they're going to find her and use her for propaganda against the imperialist West. And that's when she becomes used as a tool of that government. But there is also, at the same time, huge interest worldwide in this photograph because just of the power of photographs and the power of that image. That image, at the turn of the century, Associated Press said named it the most used photograph of the century. I saw it in advertisements. It showed up in film. It was used a number of ways because of what it evoked. So then she comes to Canada, ultimately, because she's trying to escape the country. And ultimately she does it because she's goes to a conference I think it's in Moscow, I'm trying to remember. And the returning flight, she's actually returning to Cuba because she's studying there, happens to refuel in Gander, Newfoundland, which flights don't do anymore. But then they did. And that's a stop for people to step off the plane and seek asylum. She does that. And she's determined. I mean, she's suffered. She's not been in control of her own identity. They're sitting on the plane and she says to her husband, I'm getting off. You can if you want to, or you can stay, but I'm getting off. And then she shows up follows people down a corridor and realizes she can hand over her passport and seek asylum. And Canadian officials, the first word they're trained to say, welcome to Canada.
And from Newfoundland, she ends up in Toronto.
She ends up in Toronto, and she chooses Toronto because she's looking at this map in this hotel where the asylum seekers are housed. She's looking at this map, and she doesn't even know Toronto. But in English, it sounds like the Vietnamese word for grapefruit. She thinks, oh, I recognize that word. I'll go there. So she hops on a bus, ends up in Toronto.
And it's not an easy life for her in Toronto.
So I encounter her. My agent calls me and says, the girl in the picture, remember that photo? It's seared in anybody's memory who first sees it. And are you interested in writing her story? She wants to sell her rights. She's, in a word, down and out. I show up in Toronto, and she's going to the church to collect baby clothes, diapers. I sit on a couch where one leg is missing on one side because her husband goes out on garbage collection days to scavenge for furniture. So she's really down and out and is selling her book rights. So I agree to do the book, but by then I don't agree immediately, which shocks my agent, because by then I've learned a lot about memory, and I want a story that I have to know if her memory is credible and whether I can rely on it. She was a child when that napalm bomb fell. She was 9, and it's years ago. And so that wrestling with memory again has informed all my works. What I did learn out of that, and I've learned in each of my books, is I've learned the power of living memory. In the power of living memory, with each of my subjects that I've written about, I'm wrestling with the subject themselves, whether it's my mother or Kim Phuc or the person who threw the eggs at Tiananmen Square in 1989, or now with this survivor of intimate partner violence. The power of each of my stories is that they're spilling memory for the first time. It's the first time it's spoken. So history is so much juggling of memory. But if memories are spilled for the first time, they're probably in their most pristine form they ever will be, because thereafter they're altered, they're contaminated. So it's important for those first stories to be told. Those people who have not been given voice to, or given voice to the first time, those first stories, and you go back to the Indigenous stories of intergenerational trauma, when they're first told, the power of it is immense because of this first telling. So that's what has attracted to me in my nonfiction works.
That's also of great interest to our Women's History Project. We want women who, some will be well known, some of the stories will have been told, but hopefully we'll expand it to include the not so famous women who were champions in their local communities. And it's about the power of their stories.
Exactly.
That really is the whole genesis and the whole inspiration for what we're doing.
I believe that profoundly, because you can look at role models and read about them, and yes, you can be inspired by them, but you need to really have an impact. You need for that the person to feel that I could be that. They need to feel that connection. They need to walk in their shoes. They need to have that same sort of drive that from the power of a story.
I'd like to say purpose. We want to give other people purpose.
Yes. I think that's what I was most attracted to when I read your little review, that you're going into the schools and the colleges. That's what you want to do.
You want to give them purpose and hopes. You've written a lot about women and immigrant life in Canada. Can you give us a preview of the book that's going to be out shortly?
Romana Manzoor was a professor of international relations at Dhaka University, the most renowned university in the country, on a clear upward career path. She takes a year off to do graduate studies at UBC in Vancouver. And when she's there, it's a decade into her marriage. She's living in the West. In that year, she realizes she's had the freedom to speak what's on her mind. She can come and go as she likes instead of having to be accountable to her husband. She can spend money as she likes. She can dress as she likes. And she realizes she's suffered in silence a decade of abuse by her husband, beatings. No one knows about it in her family. She's never spoken out about it. She's been ashamed that she's suffered this abuse, but she gets up the courage to tell her husband when she returns to Dhaka that she's going to divorce him. She makes the mistake of telling her husband that, not realizing that once you tell your partner that you're going to leave them, that is the most dangerous period of your life, when you're subject to physical violence, possibly a danger of losing your life. And he attacks her within days. And so brutally, the savagery of it hit the news in Bangladesh, not just because who she was, but the savagery of it, and India, the UK, Australia, and reverberated back to Canada. He severed her optic nerves, so she was just suddenly in total darkness. Then, to try and seek justice was the other huge issue. He was eventually arrested because of a public outcry. He was never charged. So the story brings up, and he died in custody. The story then brings up not just the silence of abuse, who it can happen to, there's no typical victim. The social and cultural, Bangladesh society is a patriarchy that lend itself to women being trapped within marriages, but how elusive justice is, and should we rely anyways on the law to after the incident? Shouldn't women and girls be safe to begin with? Wouldn't that be a better outcome? Romana Manzoor now lives in Vancouver. UBC brought her back to Vancouver, brought her into the hospital to try to see if anything could be done to restore her sight. That was not possible. She was totally blinded. She thought her ambitions were buried. She decides to change course and study law. So she's now a lawyer in British Columbia. And, she works for the federal government, which is probably, it's good because the federal government is very much wants to have accessibility and accommodation for those with disabilities, because the same can't be said for the working world as much as the outside working world, as much as they're trying to catch up. So the story is, Romana Manzoor out of darkness, her journey through betrayal, tyranny, and abuse, because it's not just the closest to her husband who beat her, who abused her, but there's a question of whether society wasn't also in some ways complicit and responsible and why people didn't speak up when they could have, and why the expression on the internet was, oh, you can't make a sound of clapping with one hand. This attitude of blaming the victim. Then I wanted to tackle the issue because it hasn't gone away, even though Canada even was part of the UN Declaration Against Violence Against Women. It's been declared an epidemic in Canada by various communities across the country, by police. So we may be uncomfortable speaking about it within families, but here's a story where she does have the courage to speak out. And, fortunately, it's a story of resilience in the end. But it takes courage to tell it. And I felt it's also an important issue.
What are some of the commonalities? If you take a look at Rumana Mansour, if you take a look at Kim Phuc, take a look at your grandmother, what are some of the commonalities? Immigration, the lack of visibility or being anonymous. What are some of the things that really, the thread that you're drawn to?
My grandmother, Kim Phuc, Rumana Mansour, they're women. They leave one shore and arrive at another. So they arrive and have identity issues. They have to adjust to a new society. They have to find their footing. So there are questions of, as an immigrant, you're dealing with identity. You're trying to make your way. In each case, because immigration involves a certain, almost in an individual case of why they've come, or a certain wave of immigration and why they've come, it gives you a chance to examine the society as a whole. So in each case, that moment of history with my grandmother, it was, there was this, China was a teapot spilling out men out of the spout, and first China was in poverty, and then she arrives in Canada, a very inhospitable country. So yes, she has to make her way through that and forge her own way. And so the social history was fascinating because I saw my grandmother as a very strong person because she did make her own way, even though there are elements of her life that are tragic. Kim Phuc, yes, she comes to Canada, and it's a stroke of luck in a sense that she asked for asylum, and there's a sympathetic minister of immigration who, on humanitarian grounds, says, yes, this is someone who should be admitted. And you have a society, I'm not saying the society is the savior, but when you have a society that grants you equality and opportunity and recognizes that we don't want to tolerate discrimination, then yes, then they get more of a foothold. So she has made her own life in Canada, Kim Phuc, which she probably couldn't have done in Vietnam because she would have been branded a Southerner, always one of the vanquished and not on the victor side of the war. She's been back to Vietnam, but she's actually had to go in with a bit of subterfuge because still she defected. She left the country. Rumana Mansour, would she ever have had justice in Bangladesh? She was born into a very young country. Bangladesh was barely 5-6 years old when Rumana was born. A country born out of violence. Once called a basket case by Henry Kissinger in terms of the economic poverty and corruption that it had. It infected the justice system. So just the politics and the justice system were both at a nexus. So did she ever get justice? Probably not. Did it discourage other women from coming forward in Bangladesh? Yes, probably. She's in Canada. She recognizes that she can speak out about her situation, her experience, and do so with courage. So in a sense, she's found justice in that way. She's been able to air her experience. She's been able to explain it to her young daughter who witnessed the attack. She was only 5 at the time. she's come to understand, even in her blindness, that she is a model for advocating for equity and diversity and inclusion. Because being blind, she doesn't see. She doesn't see the ethnicity. She doesn't see, the person's, whether they're tall or short or, what defines them. And when I go back to my writing, and I interviewed her, and when I'm interviewing Romana, I'm thinking, I've not had a blind subject before, but I was reminded when I first met Romana of the writer Susan Sontag writes, for a writer, the eye is a very discriminating sense. The ear is the much more humbler sense, which is true. I have found that. I learned that with my latest book. Just this without sight and the intensity with which I listen. It's brought a whole new sense also to my own abilities as a writer. So that was also very interesting as a subject. And so Romana and I have talked about how her advocacy is far beyond just a survivor of intimate partner violence. It's about inclusion and equity and fighting against discrimination.
But that's a theme that runs in a lot of your stories.
Yes.
It's about inclusion.
That's true.
Yeah. I want to just switch very quickly. We've got a few minutes before we end. You've also done something that's quite different. You did an anthology of short stories by women.
Yes.
Did any of those stories or any of those women, was there something really spectacular that you noticed, or themes, or was there one that was better than the others?
Oh gosh, that's a while ago, so I can't quite remember, right?
Okay.
But I will say this, that I'd written about my grandmother, so it's a real life which you're wrestling to the page, which is impossible actually, because a book can't contain a life. And you're worried about truth. You're a nonfiction writer, you're worried about truth. When I went to the short story genre, it still is informing me about truth. There is as much truth in fiction in capturing the essence of being. So first of all, you're looking at short stories, and yes, they're by Canadian women, but why? Well, because women were juggling work in the family, or that's all the time they had was to write short stories. That's how they got into the short story genre. So when I did that anthology, that's when I was as a writer pondering how you capture the essence of being on the page. And in the intensity of the short story, again, I'm looking for what can inform me about writing about real people. And the short stories, they're not only intense, but they capture the turbulence and the chaos of life and the contradictions of human behavior, which is exactly what the human condition is. It's not to write about it, you can't be afraid of contradiction. You have to embrace it to really understand how humans will interact and behave. And so to read fiction, and I read just as much fiction as I do nonfiction. As a writer, you're always trying to reinforce your humility as a writer. And fiction, there's such great fiction around, and the characters come off the page. It actually helps to reinforce your humility, and that's what you need to keep writing.
What stories of women from Canadian history inspire you? So other people's writing, some of those Canadian women, or which Canadian women have inspired you? Or are there women that you know of that have been overlooked?
Right. Women that inspire me, there are the historical figures that we know, from Nellie McClung, those onward, person's case. There's so many firsts that get named, the first, and we're still in that era, the first this, the first that. I've been, as maybe it's the writer in me, or maybe it's how my grandmother nearly fell into the dustbin of history. It's the women whose voices weren't heard. It's the ghosts in the landscape that are, ought to come alive again. That I'm maybe even just as curious about. And that's where, yes, we need to write about famous women and women who've inspired us and continue to, but we need to search out those other unknown ones. We need to rescue them from history and tell them and retell them. I think that's almost where my curiosity lies.
Again, I think we're just going to conclude throughout your career as a writer. What's the main skill you've learned about storytelling?
You have to have something that is eating at you. You have to have something that's unknown, that you've got the courage to go after. You have to be prepared to have your thinking turned on its head. That's how you discover something. That's how you find something fresh. So that's the advice I would give. You have to, maybe it comes back again to humility. You have to be unafraid for sure, but you have to be prepared to have your ideas poked at and prodded, and you have to be prepared to rethink things and take a fresh look. That's I think that stays with me as I tell myself as I struggle and look at the blank screen and look at the blank piece of paper. You have to be prepared for what's beyond.
Yes. No more paper. It's a blank screen. And any last words that you have to say about Canadian identity?
Oh gosh, identity it's what you have in yourself, and you can have multiple identities, and you fight against the identity that others would impose on you. And in terms of the larger Canadian identity, it's very embracing. I mean, we overuse the word inclusive, but it is the word we use. It's a sense of having a common sense of belonging, and you find those ways to belong, and you find those ways to share what you think is. You may have different pasts, but you're embracing this common future. So it's identity that makes you feel that makes you feel that you belong to in a multitude of ways.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production, with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.